First, let us introduce ourselves on this side. I'm Sheldon Flum. I'm the Vice President of Finance and Operations. Jess,
Hello there, I am Jess Jacobs, Director of Accounting and Budget here at the college.
and then Karen.
Hi, I am Karen Ash, and I am the Director of Financial Aid and Veteran Affairs.
So I asked Karen to join us today, just so that if there's questions on the financial aid part, how it affects, tuition rate increase would affect what students are getting. We have her to answer those questions. And she has a short presentation to supplement what Jess is going to talk about.
All right, there we go. So basically our process, at least how it works here at LB for kind of getting to a point of proposing a tuition rate for next year really begins in January. So at our January board meeting, we proposed a tuition increase, but it's always done in the context of our budget. So really January is a budget conversation with the board, but obviously tuition plays a big part in our budget. So that's really the understanding I want to put forward to kick this off, that the tuition rate is done in the context of overall budget conversation. And that did kick off in earnest with the board in January. And that really is an opening position for our budget. So, Sheldon and I in particular, one of our jobs here at college is, of course, to make sure we have a healthy budget, that the college is sound financially. So we open that budget conversation up with the tuition plugged in, but that's the opening position. And then we use January, February, March, and so on to get to an ending position for the budget, which of course does include a final decision on the tuition rate. The final decision does happen in March. The board will actually decide the tuition rate. So that is the opening position in January. And then we have conversations like this one, where we get input from students, get input from folks on campus, and then ultimately our board again, and then we'll have an ending position. So what's discussed in January is not set in stone as part of our budget process. And again, part of that is these student forums that we're doing today and in a couple of weeks. So really our intention in doing these is, one, transparency. We really do want to just put it out there for everybody to consume and give us feedback on. And we're welcome to any questions you want to throw our way here or offline. So feel free to we'll share our emails and you can always reach out to us. And we really want to develop that ongoing student government relationship. You guys have a great group here this year in particular, very engaged. In fact, right after that board meeting, the core group of that student government were like, hey, can we bat some stuff around and talk to you? So we actually had some good conversation leading up to these forums already. And then finally, these forums, like, this is not a sales pitch. We're not here we don't expect students to be happy about any tuition increase. Why would they be? So we're not here to sell you on like, this is what tuition has to be. We're really here to just tell you, like, here's kind of our budget and where it stands. Here's how we think tuition can plug in to kind of make this thing work. But there's a lot of different factors in our budget. So what's your feedback on, are we finding the right balance and how that's going? That's kind of what we're looking for. We're not here to, as kind of a sales pitch to push through. So that's kind of the intention of our meeting here. And that's how we kind of got to this point. So that said, unless Sheldon, you want to add anything there, we can dive into some numbers.
Yeah, just want to add a couple of things. Part of what Jess has said too, we try to make this a very transparent process for not only the students, but the campus in general. Because if we're not transparent with what we're doing, then there's a lot of questions, there's mistrust out there. Even if we can agree to disagree, at least you know where we're coming from and why we're going the way we are. But the other thing I'll throw out there is I've been at several different community colleges. And this is the first one I've been at that has a budget process like we do here. So one of the things they do here that I really like, and Jess will show you, is that 5-year projection on the budget. So you can see not only where we're going this year, but what it looks like, 4 years out. The other thing is the meeting with the student government. At my other institutions, once in a while, the students would ask what the tuition, what impact would be. But we didn't have anything set up like this where we had a formal meeting. So I really give kudos to Lynn Benton for involving the students at this level and getting their input and taking that back to the board. It's unusual and it's great.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll just jump right into some numbers. So in the name of transparency, we'll put it right out there. Part of our budget conversation was proposing an 8% tuition increase for next year over where we are right now. So just putting that directly into kind of our pricing structure, you can see here our current tuition, $122.54 per credit. That's for in-state tuition. We have $7.88 per credit in mandatory fees, cover a number of things, including athletics, student activities. That's $130.42 per credit. Now, of course, that doesn't include, like, if you take a chemistry class, for example, and there's a lab fee, like that's not included. Those are kind of course specific. These are fees that are charged to everybody. So this $130.42 is the total per credit you're paying now. Then on top of that, there is a student government fee, and that is, we break that out differently. One, because student government, that's something that they're charging for their activities. It's kind of separate from the college decision. But two, because it is a flat fee. So just want to be clear, these are per credit, and then student government charges, if you're taking more than 6 credits, you pay $8.60 flat fee. So what we're looking at, if the 8% tuition was approved, go up to $132.34. We also have a couple fees that would be linked to that 8% tuition increase. So those will go up slightly to $809. Your new total is $140. And the student government, and this is something, I would turn over to them if you want to talk more at length about what they're doing there. But they'll be moving their fee up from, in the case of if you're a full-time student, $860 to $1150. So again, per credit fees absorbing that 8% increase. The flat fee going up only $2.90 in this case. So again, $290 total for the term. So that's kind of the category breakout of sort of what this increase would mean. Looking at kind of total dollars though, if you look at a student who's taking like a full load, 15 credits, we're going from a total of $1965 to $2118, which is a difference of about $153 for the term. That would be the total kind of out-of-pocket increase based on that 8% tuition increase. You'll notice the total is actually about a little bit less than that, just because not all of the fees go up by 8%. So 7.8 in total. So that's really your impact right there. Again, if you're a 15 credit hour student, based on these proposed tuition increase. And then Karen can talk a little later about what that might mean if you factor in some financial aid. One thing we try to keep an eye on is where we stand relative to the other community colleges. This is where we stand right now in the 2021 year, again, based on 15 credits and the numbers we just looked at. So the 130.42 we see now, we've kind of been in this location for the last, well, really since I've been here, about almost the last 5 years. We've been kind of middle of the pack, if not kind of towards the bottom portion. So, obviously other schools, their local boards decide what they're going to do with their tuition. So they may do something 8%, they may do something less. We really don't know at this point what they're doing, though we've surveyed a number of schools and can kind of guess. But we do try to keep an eye on where we stand among the other schools. And so this is where LB's pricing puts us currently. And we also kind of eyeball, how tuition has moved over the last 10 years or so. And this is a graph going back to 10, 11, where we had some very substantial increases. That was due to a state aid, a reduction in how much the state gives the college. And then we kind of had as an uneven flat rate, and then we bumped it up 9% and then a few zeros. So we've tried to adopt a little smoother model that at least, students could absorb a little better rather than the spikes and valleys. So we had gone to 6, 5, 4.5. I will note that in 1920, we actually had asked for a 7% increase because we were thinking the state was going to cut us more. Turns out they didn't, but we didn't find that out till like June. So the board had voted on 7% in March, and they actually moved it down to 4% at the end of the year. So sometimes that's a little challenging part of budget, is we don't necessarily get all the information till last minute. The state plays a role in that. But that is what played out in 1920. Then with COVID, and that kind of kicked in here, we did have the 8% that you see in place this year. And as part of that conversation we had with the board, we had 8% both in the next 2 years to kind of plan out and try to make sure we come out of this thing in a healthy place. So that's why 8% is our starting point this year. That's what we had plugged into the model for the year we're in now. And we're kind of moving that forward and having the conversation from there. So that's why you see, in yellow, that's the proposed number for next year. Okay, so that's the tuition impact, and we can circle back to that. Of course, when we're done here, you guys want to look at that closer, have more questions. Folding that into the budget, though, when we look at kind of what are the key variables we have to deal with, enrollment's one of them. So we can say for this year, the one we're in now, we're down in the 12% range. It's varied a little bit, but we're down over 12%. And of course, that has an impact on our revenue. For next year, as far as the budget goes, we're projecting that we think this will be the COVID hit, and we might decrease a little bit next year. So we're just putting kind of a modest decrease of 1%. Very hard to determine what enrollment is these days. Obviously, with COVID, we have this weird thing. Usually, when the economy is going down, we see more unemployment. That typically means that enrollment actually goes up for the college. But we've had a very weird economic recovery because of COVID. It's strange. It's happened in fits and starts, and all kind of tied to restrictions that come and go. So really weird environment that makes it hard to predict. So we have kind of those competing forces that we would expect enrollment to actually go up because of uncertainty in the economy. On the other hand, we have COVID, and some people are afraid to engage with that. Can they do online learning? That kind of stuff. So difficult to predict, but that's what we're building into the model here. And then on the state aid, that's a big piece. So I should say tuition revenue accounts for about 40% of our budget. That's how we operate. And another 40% or so comes from state aid. So on that front, the governor, and this is, I want to say it's good news, but it's less bad. The governor has proposed flat funding for community colleges going into next biennium. Okay, so next biennium is going to start this next budget year for us, July 1st. But we should mention for LB, the governor or ultimately legislator determines what the whole size of the pie is going to be for all community colleges. But from there, each community college gets a slice of that pie based on really a complicated formula that involves local property taxes, a bunch of other stuff. So once you feed that through the formula for LB, flat funding from the budget from the state budget is actually going to equate to about a 2.1% decrease in the actual dollars that we get. It's one of those weird results of the formula, how that works. So when we talk about flat funding, that really means a decrease thus, not only in real dollars, but also because of inflation, right? Our costs are going up at least by inflation. And if the state doesn't increase that, our real spending power goes down. And on top of that, we get the 2.1% decrease in numbers. So again, not good news, but less bad given everything going on. We're glad we're not getting a huge cut, but still a difficult thing to absorb in our budget. And then finally, as I kind of noted, we're building some inflationary increases into our budget, and just really of all of our spending categories, because costs do go up, whether it's for software or benefits and that kind of thing. So all those things we're trying to make sure we fold into our budget model. I do want to share this graph. I mentioned about 40% of our revenue we rely on from tuition revenue, roughly 40% from the state. And we get another about 20% or a little less than that from property taxes, local property taxes. So this is a 10 plus year outlook just to kind of illustrate what's happened to those three primary revenue sources for us. Looking back in the 08-09 range, once upon a time, the state covered the lion's share of funding for our college and how we operated. The state gave us more money, and we relied on less tuition revenue to operate. This chart really illustrates that the state cut us pretty dramatically at that time, and it's taken about over a decade really to get back about here. It's about 9-10 years to even get back to where we were 10 years ago. And though we had a big spike, you can see it's kind of flattened out even now. So that's obviously what's had to step up and offset that has been the tuition revenue. Property taxes are great because, as you can see, they're steady and there's a nice steady incline. They're very reliable. Unfortunately, because of statute, we have a permanent tax rate. And so it is what it is. We can't change it. We get about 20% of our revenue or a little less than that, like I said. So we do really, we really are at the mercy of the state to fund us at a level where we don't have to rely as much on tuition revenue. And that's kind of the dynamic we've seen have to play out over time in the last 10, 12 years. So that's just kind of a reality for the funding model that community colleges have to work with. So factoring all that in, let me take just a couple minutes to drag you through a what looks like a really messy spreadsheet, but it's not too bad. But I think it's important we share it with you because this is the exact same thing we put in front of our board. It's what we looked at in January. So this is our 5-year budget model that Sheldon alluded to. To start, we have a revenue on top, right? And so we're projecting how we're going to end this current year. And then, of course, we're making our assumptions going forward the next 5 years. And on top, we start with revenue, those 3 primary revenue sources we just talked about. And then we do have just miscellaneous other things that add up. So we're projecting that out. These categories here on the expense side really represent all of our operations. So that's people we're paying, benefits we're paying, software, supplies, you name it. Transfers out category that covers things like our major maintenance, like keeping our facilities running, big investments we have to do there and that kind of thing, paying debt on our bonds and stuff like that. This is all ongoing kind of annual operations we fold into those categories. We have what we kind of consider like more of our investment categories. So this is new money outside of just day-to-day operations that we're plugging in. Call these performance packages. That's just a name we give to increases in our budget. That could be hiring a new faculty or paying for a new software that we're using or something like that. Capital projects, that actually represents new buildings, an actual new facility that we need to make sure we have operational funds for. See, the only number there relates to our Benton Center that we expect to be fully functional in 21-22. Sorry, I should say the new building, the new Benton Center in Corvallis. So we'll make sure they have that money there. And then strategic investments is really a one-time pool of money that we keep for new ideas, new innovations that the college wants to do. But that number doesn't roll forward. It's just that one pot of money for that 1 year. And that's been an ongoing thing we've had for quite a while. And then finally, we build in a place for any cost reductions or gains in efficiency. So you can see that's a negative number. That's where we're making reductions to our budget. So that kind of covers all of the expense categories. And then of course, at the bottom, you see the net, right? So if that's green, that means we brought in more than we spent. And if it's red, it means we're doing deficit spending. So we're having to take out of our reserves to cover that, just like you would in your personal finances. If you spent more than you made that month, you're gonna have to dip into either into a credit card or into your savings account. In our case, we're dipping into our savings account when we do that. Now, we do believe that there is some federal funding. It's called CARES Fund, and now the latest act is called the CARISA Act. But there is some one-time funding coming from the federal government that we believe will help offset most of this deficit spending. We're still learning about all the rules associated with that, but we do believe that one-time funds will help us not have to dip into our savings account like we're doing here, but we're still in the planning phase on what we can do with that money. So a couple of the other things I want to point out on here. One, in terms of, again, in the name of transparency, let me go back. We are looking at making some additions to our budget. Again, this is new things we're adding to our budget. Same time though, we are looking to, as you can see, plug in some cost reductions at the same time, and they're in very similar amounts. So we're kind of looking at a model going forward here where, the new investments we make into the college are offset by reductions at the same time or close to. That's one of the challenging parts of, I guess, running a business or a school is that, sometimes if you don't have enough resources, you have to get rid of something to do something else that you think might be more beneficial to your customers or your students. So it's kind of the model we're trying to work with. And you can see this year, the 2021 year, we actually did about $2 million in cost reductions. It was part of our conversation with the board last year to say, we have a tuition increase, but we also need to do some reductions at the same time. So we do have about $2 million that we did have to cut out of our budget. And for us, unfortunately, that often means positions and people's jobs, about 86. And you can tell from these numbers, about 87% of our budget goes to people. And then the rest goes to, everything else, what we call materials and services. So So this is the budget we put together. And again, as part of this, our goal is to make sure the college is not doing an undue amount of deficit spending. And again, we're hopeful that some of the one-time federal money can help with that. But then really to make sure we come out of this period of time with a sustainable budget, right? So that means we don't have a structural budget deficit. We're not running huge deficits. So that was part of the thinking of plugging in that 8% tuition number, which does impact this year, right? And as that carries through this 5-year model, we can come out of this time in a healthy place as a college. So that is the budget model, the one we shared with our board.
Just before we move on, a couple other things I want to point out. So if you notice for the current year, we're actually showing a surplus about 560,000. Couple things happened on that. Originally, we were counting on a bigger decrease in state funding, and that did not come through, which is good. So that helps, because originally we had about a $700 to $1 million deficit for the current year. The other thing that's happened is if you look at our materials and services for the current year, Jess has estimated that's going to be at about 5.3, and that's going to estimate actual expenditures. And what's happened is because we're in a pandemic, working remotely, there's a lot of things that we're currently saving money on. And that's what you see there. The decrease is from the savings from the pandemic and working remote. We're anticipating in the budget for next year having more of the operations on campus. And that's why you see an increase there of 5.8, is because we're anticipating going back to whatever the new normal is. But if it hadn't been for the savings there, we would be even or deficit spending for the current year.
So that's kind of the all-in budget look. That was part of the January conversation again, and the 8% tuition increase next year is part of what makes these numbers work the way they do. So kind of conclude at least our conversation, we'll open it up to questions, is again, 8% tuition currently on the table. The board is not making that official choice until March board meeting. And then we actually don't approve our actual budget until May and June. There's kind of a two-step process there, but the budget itself, which won't be approved till the end of the year. And I do want to point out that regardless of what happens with our budget and with where the tuition rate ultimately lands, we do want to continue to push our ongoing kind of affordability effort, whether that's through more affordable textbooks or OERs, as we call them, through finding better ways to reach out with students with some targeted scholarships, moving some CARES money. And maybe Sheldon, you can talk a little bit about what we know on the CARISA Act as far as direct student aid. We want to do more there. And of course, we'll get the feedback on this whole conversation from you guys. But yeah, Sheldon, would you mind mentioning a note on the CARISA Act?
Sure. And then Karen's got a couple of slides on financial aid she'll be going over too. So with the CARES money that came through last summer, we had $1.3 million worth of student funds, and then $1.3 million worth of institutional funding. On the institutional side, the majority of that money went to help us with the conversion to go remote in our teaching. About 15% roughly of that funds went directly to students to help them with either equipment, technology, hotspots. And we had, I don't have the number right in front of me, a large portion of it went to our infrastructure for technology, because we had to upgrade our servers and internet connections and a lot of other things to be able to support online learning. And then a portion of it went to offset the additional costs that we had as an institution because of the pandemic. We had cleaning, extra equipment we had to buy, protective equipment, things like that. On the student side, what we did is we put together a task force to say how best to get this to the students. And at that point, the students had to be Title IV eligible, which means they have to be eligible for financial aid. So we had those requirements. And at that time, we had part-time students, so they would have to be at least 6 credit hours or more to qualify for the aid. And we also based it on what's called unmet need. So based on the rules, how much of after financial aid do you have left to cover for your schooling and other expenses? So based on that, we had awards that range from $100 to $700. We did that in the spring, summer. In the fall, the awards were a little less because we were running out of funds. So now with this new batch of funds, we have $4.7 million for the institution. And as Jess said, we're still trying to figure out what that money can be used for, but it is one time, and we're hoping to offset some of our operating costs with that. But we also received $1.3 million for the students again. And what we were able to do, because they loosened up the requirements a little bit, we are looking at those funds still going to Title IV eligible students. However, we can eliminate the part-time requirement having 6 hours. So anyone that's enrolled in one credit or more is qualified. And so again, our awards will be between $100 and $700 depending on your unmet need. And we're hoping those funds will start going out next week. So you should be seeing some funds if you qualify real soon. Karen, why don't you go ahead and show us what you have on the financial aid side of things.
Good.
And while she's getting set up, Johnny had a question. He said that he believes that they're moving the effective date for the CARES from December to March. We hope they do. That is unofficial yet. The way the act was originally written, it was supposed to be to the declaration of the pandemic in March, so we could pick up costs there. Something happened in the drafting of the bill, and it ended up that it was not retro. So it was anything after December 27th when the bill was signed, which really limits us on what we can do in the current year. The legislators are looking at seeing if they can correct that. We don't know how soon that's going to be because we have the transition between administrations, which is slowing down some of these things. And that's also part of the problem with getting the details on what the funds can be used for, is because we've had a transition in the Department of Education where this is under, and that team's not complete yet. So Johnny, does that help?
Yeah. I had a meeting with Senator Merkley earlier this week, and that was one of the topics he's bringing up to the education committee he's on. And I think like overwhelmingly looking at support for that proposed bill, it's not unrealistic to believe that date is going to change.
We certainly hope it does.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Karen.
Yeah. Okay, so everyone can see?
Yes.
Okay, good. I always worry about that. So, okay, so I'm going to discuss the funding levels for financial aid. And so in this discussion, we are just going to look at the federal and the state aid that our students are receiving. And so first, we're going to look at what it is the students can expect for the 21-22 school year. And so all of the information that's listed on here is based on students that are full-time enrollment. So 12 or more credit hours is full-time. And then they also have a 0 expected family contribution, or you might hear that a term EFC. And this is also broken out per term. So step back and explain what the EFC is. So when a student completes their financial aid application, so the FAFSA, whenever they submit that, they get this little magic number back, and that is the expected family contribution. And so what happens with that is the number that financial aid administrators use to determine what type of aid and how much of that aid that the student is eligible to receive for the entire academic year. And then from there, we divide that out, how much the student is receiving per term. So for the 21-22 academic year, students that are a 0 EFC and they are full-time enrolled, they can expect a maximum Pell Grant of $2,165. So that is per term. So the maximum amount that a full-time 0 EFC student can receive for the academic year is $6,495. And so that's broken out per term. The Oregon Promise and Oregon Opportunity, right now, this number that's presented is based upon the 2021 academic year. So I'll reference back to what Jess was talking about, and in one of his slides, he had showed the different community colleges' state budget. So the Oregon Promise, the legislators use the average amount of all of the community colleges' tuition and budgets to determine how much the Oregon Promise is going to be for the following academic year. And also just talked about how our budget isn't actually finalized until, May or June. Well, so are other community colleges. And so until all the community colleges in the state of Oregon have set their budgets and reported that amount to the state, then the state legislators can then make the decision on how much the Oregon Promise Grant is going to be. So right now, the Oregon Promise, Oregon Opportunity, they're not set to increase, but that is subject to change based upon what the state decides. Subsidized loans for the academic year or per term is $1,167, and that equates out to a first-year student. So a first-year student is someone who has less than 30 credit hours. So the maximum amount for the year is $3,500. And so subsidized loans, the maximum amount on those are not going to increase for the 21-22 school year as well. When they do increase, the Department of Education, they set those on July 1st of the following year. So they were actually set last July. So we know those aren't going to increase. So that's the maximum amount that a student could expect in a term for the 21-22 year as a full-time student. So now I want to go through the type of aid that our students receive. And so move forward. And so all of this information is based on the 1920 academic year, simply because we're still in the 2021, so we don't have all of the data, and we'll have new students coming in the spring, and so we're just not able to provide that yet. So we are looking at a year back. And so for the 1920 year, we had 7,157 students that were degree-seeking students. And so that number is unduplicated. So I'll kind of unpack that a little bit. So a degree-seeking student is a student that is receiving either a certificate or a degree. And so thus meaning that they are meeting one of the eligibility criteria to receive federal aid. You must be a degree-seeking student. And then the unduplicated headcount side of that means that if a student is attending for fall and then for winter and for spring, then we're only counting them once within this population. So with that, of the approximately 7,000 students that we have attending, we had 2,947 students that received some form of either federal or state aid or both. And so that equates out to approximately 41 of our students are receiving either federal or state aid. And so when we look at each fund as to the students that are actually receiving this aid, we can say that 65% of the students that are receiving aid, they are receiving a Pell Grant. And then if you go and look at the next column, the OOG, that's the Oregon Opportunity Grant. So 34% of our students receive the Oregon Opportunity. OPG is the Oregon Promise. So 35% receive Oregon Promise. And then 41% of our students receive subsidized loans. 38% receive unsubsidized loans. And so the difference between the two of those, subsidized means that the government is paying the interest for our students while they are in school. Unsubsidized means that the interest is accruing on the loan while students are attending. And then only about 1% of our student population receiving aid is actually receiving a Parent Plus loan. And so Parent Plus loans are specific to our dependent students, and parents have to apply for this, and then the parents are the ones responsible for paying this loan back. So as we know, all of our students receive a combination of different types of aid. And so I've grouped together the most popular ones. And again, we are just looking at state and federal aid. And so looking at this population, and that's going back to that 2,900 number. Of that 2,900, 21% of our students are receiving both Pell and Oregon Promise. And then 33% are receiving Pell and Oregon Opportunity. And then 28% of the population receive all three of those benefits. And then Pell and subsidized loans is at 84%. So all of these numbers, what we're really wanting to do is to really look at, and compare what is it that the financial aid award offer looks like versus the tuition increase that we're talking about. And so I wanted to go back and look. These are the numbers for the current year that we're in, this 2021 year. So as I mentioned before, the Oregon Opportunity and Oregon Promise, we don't know if they're going to change. We already know subsidized loan is not going to change. So the only thing that has changed is the Pell Grant. And so that has increased from the 2021, which we're currently into, the 21-22 by $50 per term, or $150 for the academic year. And so that's where on the previous slide, we saw the 2,165. And so the impact that this has for our students. So here I took what our current tuition rate is, and I have applied what our increased amount of financial aid for the 21-22 school year is going to be. So if we look at the first column, that's the current, and then I have it broken out into different sections of students that are receiving all grants. So in other words, if we have a student that is our high need, which is our 0 EFC students, the maximum that they're going to get for every grant they're eligible for is $3,375. So if we take our tuition and subtract that, then that student is realizing a refund of $1,801. So that's that red amount that you're seeing. So the red is something that's actually coming back to the student. It's a negative balance, so it's a refund. And so as we look across the board for the 5% increase and the 8% increase, we can see what either that lesser amount of a refund is, or how much additional that student is going to be paying out of pocket. And so that second group where you see tuition OPG for the Oregon Promise Grant, we see that by term, a student is the maximum amount of an Oregon Promise Grant. So in other words, this is a student that has a really high EFC, so they're not eligible for any other type of aid. They are only receiving the Oregon Promise Grant. They're going to receive $1,285 per term, or the maximum, which is the $3,855 per year. They're going to see that in how much they owe back to the institution. So right now it's approximately $288. And so with a 5% increase, you're going to see it at $366 owed to the college, and then an 8% at $411. And then I've also done the same with subsidized loans, because there are students that are only eligible for loans, and often we saw they take just the subsidized, the one that the interest is being paid for our students. So I'm happy to go back, but I also want to make sure, give you time for questions, but I also want you to have our contact information. Should you have any questions, our email address is there and our phone number. Please feel free to reach out to us. We're here to help and answer those questions. So I will turn it back over for questions.
All right. I think at this point, we just open it up to the group for questions for either Jess or Karen or myself.
Yeah.
And Karen, you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. So we can see everybody again.
Absolutely.
Hey guys, I have a question. So this is for Jess and Sheldon. I've been doing some digging this week, and admittedly, currently, while everyone was speaking, and I'm looking at a lot of our competitor um, community colleges out of the 17 in the state, and I'm seeing a trend that I'm curious if you guys can speak on why you aren't following the same suit. But for instance, two of our competitors, Clackamas and Chemeketa, are building their tuition increases, which are more than half or less than half what we are currently proposed to increase, with Clackamas being at 4.6%, and Chemeketa's increase only being, I believe, 2.1% at the highest. But both of them in their proposals have stated it as if the state funding for community colleges is 700 million or above, we'll do the slow amount. If it's 700 million and below, we'll do this other increase. So it looks like they're planning on having two options at hand ready to go. I'm just curious why you guys, or like what the decision is to do. We're doing 8%, and then if we get more money, cool, we'll pocket that money. So if you guys could like maybe speak on the planning side of it a little bit, and why you deviate from the other major community colleges in the state.
Well, you have to be a little careful because a lot of times you're not necessarily comparing apples to apples, because what some of the colleges did last year or for the current year, as opposed to increasing tuition, they put in additional fees. We chose not to do that. So sometimes the increase is hidden. But the 8% that is in there now is basically carried over from the current year's budget. So when we put together the current year's budget at 8%, at that point, we had the 8% increase for next year built into it as part of what we thought that the increases were going to be. And that's what was presented to the board. And now what we'll do is gather additional information going forward and see what it looks like the state funding is going to be and what enrollment looks like, and then we'll be adjusting it from there. But in the past, we just haven't gone with an optional rate that I know of, but doesn't mean it's off the board either.
Yeah, I was gonna say we haven't formalized that as you described, kind of as they do. They're like kind of creating sort of an if-then statement. But I can say we have the same thinking. So I don't think we're out of line with what they're doing. We have the same model of thinking, and that's why we use this. This is the live version of the screenshot I shared with you on our budget model. So like we do have this set up to where if the state, instead of giving us 0, says, hey, we're going to be like a 5% increase, that, just kidding. Hold on. Oh, I'm in the wrong tab. Sorry, bear with me a sec. Just brought this one up. If my model's working, 5%. All right, I have the wrong file up. Oh no. Well, I was going to show you how it actively changes our numbers, but I clearly have the wrong file up. Sorry, just kidding. You guys saw the working one last week. You know it works. Anyway, we do have a model, right? A live model that we can plug the number into and say, yeah, the state looks like they're going to give us 5% instead of 0. And that's when we have that conversation with our board. We kind of tend to do it more in real time rather than sort of a prescribed, if this happens, then we're going to do this kind of model. And that's actually what played out. I mentioned in 1920 when we found out, oh, they're going to give us a little more than we thought. We changed that number, and then the board had the conversation, said, all right, cool, we can bring it down from 7 to 4. So I guess just to answer your question, we think the same way as the other schools. We just kind of don't formalize it kind of the same way.
And with the conversation that'll happen in March, that's with our board. We have a budget committee, which is made up with some people from the community on it. And when we had the meetings in May for the current budget, I can tell you there was a lively discussion on tuition and the increases that were proposed. And actually at that one, we actually came down because we were looking at a higher rate, and based on the feedback from the students and from the committee, we actually decreased it So nothing is set in stone at this point, but yeah, the 8% is the starting point. Yeah.
Sorry about my model. I looked at, I had hard coded the state aid number in the moment. Sorry about that. I can give you a live one later. Also, I want to note I put my email in the chat if you guys have questions you want me to follow up on or think of later. So.
And we did read the comments in Angie's board report from the students. And so we're well aware of some of the feelings out there, and those will all be passed on to the board. And any comments we receive from this forum, then the next one, next Friday, definitely goes to the board also for their consideration.
Yeah, I got a question for Karen. If this tuition increase goes through, what's going to be the cost to get a degree at LB?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I haven't done an analogy with that. So if we have what, so are you talking like a 90 credits? So a 2-year degree?
Yes.
Okay. So Jess, do you have your handy calculations there? So, I mean, if you just base it on 90 credits at what the tuition increase is, then you would have that answer. But then, I mean, you're not taking into account anything else that would be fluid within that.
And I'm just curious, if you have to go into debt to pay for that, how much more additional cost are you paying for interest on top of that cost for the degree?
And so
I'm thinking if it goes up 8%, it's actually going up more than 8% because you're also paying interest on that 8%,
If you're receiving a student loan, correct. And so it's based upon whatever that student loan rate is set at, which is a part of the actual spending levels as well. So the interest rate is set every July 1st. And so currently it's at that 4.3%. And so now that is also deferred while you are in school. So it's a great question. There's a lot of answers to it. So you would have to take, if you were only receiving loans, and if you were only taking those loans at subsidized, then that interest isn't actually accruing until you actually graduate, drop below half-time, or cease attendance. So there's a lot of variables with that. So it would be more on when you go into repayment and how long you choose to take to pay your loans back. And so I would actually refer you to studentaid.gov. And there is some great loan estimator calculators out there where you can go and put in there that I received a subsidized loan during the 18-19 school year, and I'm just estimating this because I don't remember the interest rate from the 18-19, but that the interest rate was X amount of dollars, and then this year, and I took out this, and you can go through and actually estimate what your actual cost would be based on the loan amount that you, the student, took out.
Yeah, if you're looking for just a hard and fast number on just the tuition piece, based on 90 credits, it'd be about $900 rounded. That's my quick math. But yeah, Karen's right. If you kind of wanted to fold in the financing piece and all that, you probably want to get into some more sophisticated calculators there. But that's the quick answer to your tuition question. Yeah.
Right.
I got one more question for Jess and Sheldon. I talked to you guys at an earlier meeting, and we talked a little bit about where you guys can cut costs when you have a shortfall. And I know that you guys said you're not really popular sometimes because you give bad news to a lot of people. I'm just curious, who makes the decisions, like the strategic decisions for the budget, and who really decides that, and why are they choosing to put it, at least this time, all on the students compared to looking for other ways to set things up?
So there's two levels of decisions made. So we have a policy governance set up. So what happens is at the board level, they give us the directions on which way we should be going. So they set the broad parameters. Once they set that, then we as managers and administrators, we figure out how to make it work internally. So if the board said, okay, we're not going to approve a 8% tuition rate, we're going to go with we'll go with a 4%, then based on that, we then back into the figures and say, okay, here's what we have for revenue coming in. And then we have two directions we can go. We can either spin in a deficit or we cut costs. And they would say, okay, well, this is what we want you to do. We would figure out how to do it. And from there, we would get down into the nitty gritty through a budget committee, budget team to say, here's where the cuts are actually going to be. Like that $2 million we have in the current year, that came from the direction from the board. We sat down and looked at all the different programs, both on the academic side and the operational side, say, okay, where can we save money? And that's where we determined where the cuts came, what departments, some of the programs got cut to come up with that $2 million. So no one person does it all, but it comes from the board to the president to us, and then we get to do the hard work. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
We do try. I mean, we're as a community college, this has been my experience, not just here, but in other places. Community colleges tend to run pretty lean, generally speaking, in our budget. We do try to be pretty judicious about what we add to the budget. So while I can't share the line item, like here's exactly what we want to do next year as far as this into the budget, I can say the vast majority of it is like classroom focused. We're looking for bottlenecks where we have, waitlist students we can't offer enough sections. So do we need to add a full-time faculty, like that kind of conversation. That is the challenging part, right? That's part why we're asking you guys about, do we have the right balance? Like what's your input on that? But it is really a shared decision making. It's not like Sheldon and I alone are like, oh yeah, let's do this, yes and no, because it's not always just a budget decision, right? It's kind of the quality versus cost conversation. So it's kind of a shared governance thing. And that's where we like input from you guys, not only just like during a budget conversation, but just year round, where it's like, hey, here's a service that students are telling us that they really want to see more of. They really need it. That's good input for reasons to add to the budget and justify tuition increase. Conversely, you may say, we're seeing this area, like this, there's not a lot of value to this. So you guys sure you want to continue paying for this? Because students don't see a lot of value to it. Great reason for possible, cost savings that we want to consider. So, you guys are the consumer, right? So that's feedback I look to as a business-minded person to help us find this balance.
I have a question. I don't know if this applies 100%, but I am a full-time student and I've been able to use the grants to pay my LB tuition in full every term, and it's been really nice that way. And then I'll be going to OSU where the grant doesn't cover the OSU tuition because it's a university. Will there become a time at LB if they continue raising the tuition where you will have to pull out loans because the grant will no longer cover? Is that something that could happen, or is it kind of the grants will raise as the tuition raises as well?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, I mean, I can step in on the financial aid side of it. And so as we saw for this upcoming year, for the 21-22 year, they have raised the Pell Grant amount by $50 per term. That was also the same for the current year that we're in now, 2021, as well as the prior year, 19-20. So for the last 3 consecutive years, the Pell Grant has been raising by $50 per term. Whether that will continue, I mean, your guess is as good as mine for that. It is all part of the Higher Education Act. And so it really is dependent upon what our legislators do on the federal side of it. As far as like loans increasing, I have been in financial aid for 16 years and I have only seen loans increase once over that time. And that was back in the early 2000s, and that was only to the subsidized loan amount. So I know there is some talk with increasing on loans, but it hasn't happened in the last decade. So
Yeah, part of the problem is that everything that we have is so politically based. I mean, the federal level, we have the Pell Grants. On the state level, we have the Oregon Opportunity and Promise, and those. It's all based on politics. And unfortunately, sometimes they don't consider the hard facts on, what it does cost to go to school when they're generating those figures. And so there's so much out of our control that it's really hard to say. But what I can tell you is the board is very concerned about keeping the education as affordable as possible for our students. I mean, we hear that all the time in these budget conversations.
Another thing I'd add is while we would hope that, they increase grants and aid, in line with increasing costs of that, the net cost to you is, doesn't get worse over time. What I would hope is the bigger push is to go lobbying and kind of politically push for just more higher and more consistent base funding from the state. Because, the students in the college need to kind of bounce off each other to find the right balance on tuition, but hopefully both of our sides can push the state hard to address this, which I already showed you guys. This chart, wait, is it showing? Yeah. This chart here to me is what they need to address. Like, this is to me the obvious correlation between the rise in tuition over the last 10 years. It's not out of control spending, in my opinion. And I know we can have differing opinions on kind of where we should see cost savings and what we should add and not. And we can and should look for better ways to operate. But by and large, and I think you can see this nationwide, a divestment of the state from higher ed is what's led to tuition increases, particularly at the community college level. So this, I'd like to see legislative push lobbying on the lobbying side across the board for states that start recognizing that, finding ways to not only get back to a model that looks like this, where they're paying the lion's share of the funding, but also commit to a way to fund it consistently. It's one thing to give us a lot of money, but then take it away for 2 years and then bring it back. Like how can any of us plan with that? So that's what I'm hopeful. And we've been pushing hard on kind of Sheldon's level, his counterparts across the state, working with the presidents to really get legislators to understand, like, this is how you can impact tuition. We appreciate you trying to bump up the grants and those kinds of things, but like, you can make the whole thing more affordable by a consistent funding model, which hasn't worked very well in Oregon. And, it's complicated. It has a lot to do with the revenue model that the state works on, right? It's very reliant on income tax and that kind of thing. So it's different state by state, but that's my hope too, that like everybody involved here can really push for a better model that just reduces the affordability issue across the board. So that's my take on that. Like James said, Sheldon and I aren't always the most popular on campus. We are always pushing like, hey, where can we cut costs? Where can we find more ways to be efficient? Because maybe we can't solve the world's problems, but we can at least try to keep as much downward pressure as we can on that front. So it's an ongoing effort.
Are there any other questions for Sheldon, Jess, or Karen?
And if you think of questions later, you can send it to us or invite us back to another one of your meetings, and we're happy to come back and answer questions for you.
We'll be back 2 weeks from today, I believe, for another one of these. And if we have new information, we'll definitely bring it. And if you guys want us to bring something else, again, my email's in the chat, so you can send it my way.
Jacob, did you have a question?
Yeah. So I heard there's a rumor going on that ending fund balance that was predicted last year changed, and budget cuts changed, but you guys are keeping the tuition increase, and I was just wondering why that is.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch all that. Might be my hearing. Did you get that, Jess?
Yeah, I think so. I was gonna pull up a chart if I could. So I think the crux of your question is, so initially, we thought the fund balance and kind of state aid was going to be a different conversation, and that changed, but the tuition rate did not change. Kind of from where we were last year. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I did want to pull up, sorry, give me just a sec. I was going to pull up a chart to kind of help illustrate what you're saying. Last time I pulled something up, it didn't work. So I want to make sure I grab the right thing. Let's see. Because one thing we did do, because thinking back when we first kicked off this year's budget, at the time, we thought state funding was going to be a pretty big cut. So we were kind of preparing for that. It's part of why we put these 8% tuition increases in place. And when we found out that wasn't necessarily going to be the case, we did keep the tuition there, but we also moved forward with our cost reductions too, because we were going to do over $2 million in reductions. And we went forward with that because our concern the whole time had been, we need to come out of this in that kind of that 5-year model in a healthy place. Part of that conversation does relate to our fund balance, which that's what I was going to try to pull up for you. So I didn't include the chart on this particular presentation. Let's see. Bear with me.
Well, just was looking for that. The one thing I can say, and this is nationwide, I've been attending a lot of different, meetings virtually. And what everyone has said is that all the models that we used for predicting either enrollment, budgets, whatever, they have all broke in the pandemic. So, when this started and we were setting the current budget, we looked at the parameters the best we could and then put the budget together based on those figures. And then after that, there was a lot of changes that came through that, like just mentioned, originally we were thinking an 18% decrease in state funding. Then it went to a 12 to an 8, and it just keeps changing. So like I said, we did the best we could with what we had. But go ahead, Jess.
Yeah, so the chart in front of you is actually a chart of our fund balance. Okay, so fund balance is the term we give to our reserves or our savings account, if you want to think of it that way. So earlier I was talking about like a deficit, like where we spent more money than we brought in, or the opposite, we had a surplus. That impacts our savings account, right? So what we see here is on the orange line, that's our actual fund balance. That's our actual reserve levels. And then this blue line is a 10% target level. So what that is our board has told us you need to keep at least 10% of your annual budget set aside kind of in your savings account. And that's actually very consistent across all the schools in Oregon. It's a national kind of benchmark people recommend. So that's kind of the level where you want to really pay attention. If you go below that 10%, you're kind of getting into the red zone where like, hey, your savings account's getting a little too low. So the conversation we had at the beginning of the year we're in now with our board, before the state aid, we determined that wasn't going to go down. At the time, we thought it was going to go down. And here's what we were proposing that they agreed to. We were actually going to fall below this blue line. We were going to go below our target fund balance. So we were like deliberately going to go in the danger zone, so to speak, a little bit. And I don't mean to characterize like we're going out of business, but it's like, hey, you're dipping into your savings account. We're actually going to go below that and then dig our way out over the next couple of years, which, to be honest, is not an ideal position. But of course, we were facing a really substantial cut from the state at the time. So we're going to adopt doing that. So part of our thinking, and even though we heard the state was going to not cut us like we thought they were, part of why we moved forward with the tuition increase and why we moved forward with the cost reduction was because this model was not ideal. And we really did not want to adopt it unless we had to. So instead, we moved to a different model, which now I have too many windows open. Hold on. Wait, can you see the new screen? Oh, you can't. Hold on. You share a separate
Yeah, we
one?
can see it.
Oh, you can. Oh, sorry.
Well, not now.
We bring it back. This one. So now we're looking to adopt a model more like this, that we do some deficit spending that you saw, but we need to kind of stay above that target balance here. So I think my color switched on you, but So I guess to answer your question, the reason we kind of stuck with both the tuition increase and those substantial cost cuts we did was because we really did not want to have to dip into that model, because they call it a rainy day fund for a reason. We really want to try to avoid that for the long-term health of the college. So that's at least part of the reason we move forward with that. And
Just-
while we're
Can I try to clarify what I think Jacob was saying?
yeah.
What I think he was saying is that when you did the projections last year, there was the budget cut that was listed in, and there was the tuition increase which was listed in, and there was the ending fund balance which was listed in. And then you made projections for this year, which had additional budget cuts and had the additional 8% tuition increase and had additional cuts to the ending fund balance. What I think he's asking is, as of the model you're looking at right now, you've changed the ending fund balance to a lesser amount, and you've taken out the budget cuts that were projected for this year, but you've kept the tuition increase the same. I think he's trying to figure out why that is. Is that right, Jacob? Is that what you're trying to get to?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Gotcha.
Again, that goes back to the 8% is a starting point to, here's where our best guess is at the time. This is carryover from the current year on the model. And so this is where we're starting the conversation.
Yeah, valid question, and it's part of us too, trying to assess where we're at after a $2 million reduction, which does really impact us. That's not a small bite for a school our size. So kind of assessing what is that doing to our staffing models? Where does that put us? If we take on another big bite, like are we really dipping into services we can provide students? We did have to cut some academic programs to get to the 2 million. So that's kind of saying, wow, what are we losing out on, or what are students ultimately going to lose out on if we don't do that? So again, it's kind of, we did a really big cut last year. What's the impact? So I think that's part of the thinking, but part of why we've just let's kind of ease off on any more huge cuts to kind of see where we're at, and hopefully not have to cut more programs or services to students. Again, part of that difficult balance, but thank you for the feedback, though. I think you guys are looking for a different balance.
I think everything was answered very well in the presentation. At first, I had a bunch of questions, but now I'm like, everything's been answered. You guys did really good.
Thank you.
Thank you.